I'm looking at storage of food when we don't have electricity. This is something that many people don't think about in their country property, that at the very least they'll have solar power and so on. But there's times when that may not be possible, and there's other situations that may arise where you need to consider other options as well. So let's have a look at some of these. Just from a biblical viewpoint, I know some people, particularly new to country living, have issues about storing food, but the Bible makes it quite clear that there are situations where that's certainly relevant. As we see here, a prudent man foresees the difficulties ahead and prepares for them. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. And the other one, anyone who does not provide for their relatives and especially their own household has denied the faith and is worse than the unbeliever. So there's certainly good advice in storing food. Some of the things I'm going to talk about won't be relevant to everyone, so let's look at some important points first. Most food storage we're used to in refrigeration or freezing. In general terms, the food storage is required at 4 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. These are things like meat, dairy, seafood, poultry, cooked food, sauces, and anything that's been opened. However, when we look at room temperature, which I've averaged around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit, there are some things that are quite happy at that room temperature, such as honey, oils, unopened cans or jars, breads, bananas, tomatoes, onions, even other veggies there as well. And of course, your grains and pulses. So these are some things to consider in the different types of storage. For off-grid, a lot of people will look at a propane or gas fridge, particularly if they're starting out with little or no solar power, using a generator, for example. The propane or gas fridge is an option for them. It's something that's familiar to people because they're used to using refrigeration, but it can be useful for the first setup, but it's usually a lot more expensive. And of course, it's not a viable option in terms of being able to keep food without being dependent on another source, such as your gas. You can get 3-way fridges, which have both DC electricity for solar connection, have AC electricity, and also gas connections. That's the type of thing you quite often see in RVs and caravans as well. Usually they're a little smaller, but like I said, the cost is usually much larger than your standard refrigerators. Some better options, cold air tends to fall. So as soon as you open the door, the cold air falls out. So better options are usually such ones as the chest style, whether it's fridge or freezer or a combination. They're more efficient because when you open the lid, the cold stays in there. But of course, you're still reliant on gas there. I have seen some people convert the gas fridges over to biogas or methane, which would be a continuous resource available on the property if set up correctly. But I haven't looked into that myself or tried it yet to see what the results are like. This one most people would be familiar with, an ice box. The blue one here is very common here in Australia. We call them Eskies. That's the brand name that started them here. The one on the right is actually a Victorian ice box, which would be used back in Ellen White's times, where they put ice in to try and preserve the food. Now, these, we probably say, why would we use those when we're living off grid, because it's more for things like camping or going on a picnic. But it really depends on how you're producing that ice or using that ice as well. So, for example, on my property, it's actually quite cold in the winter time. It's freezing. So it's actually possible to put out containers of water and freeze it overnight and then use that during the day, for example. So that could be an option for some people as well, just depending on your location. So I'm going to have a look at a few different methods of preserving food. We have storage methods in terms of canning. It's simply a way of preserving the fruit and vegetables so that they can be sealed and stored at room temperature. And this is one of the most common ones. This one's a bit different. This is what was done traditionally back again in the 1800s, where a lot of the vegetables, particularly root vegetables, would be stored in sand or in dirt. It'd actually be buried. You can also do this with things like cabbage and other brassicas, but they can tend to ferment underground as well. You'd also have to be careful on where you buried this as to what time of year, whether you had frozen ground situation and things like that. But the root vegetables seem to work well here because they stay in the soil or the sand. They don't have access to air or a lot of moisture, so they tend to preserve there for quite some time. This is another method using sugar. A lot of fruit's done that way, using jams or jellies and so on, or even just doing a candied process like this one with ginger here. You can also do that with other fruits. Instead of using just sugar as well, this one here is actually citrus preserved in honey. So if you have bees on your country property and access to a lot of honey, this is another method that you could use for preserving food. And it's not just fruits there too. For those that are familiar with using honey for preserving, you'll know that you can do things like, certainly lemon is used there for medicinal purposes, but you can also preserve garlic in honey as well. You can get discoloration with that, but that's perfectly normal in those situations. This is another common method, that's the drying. So this one, you can dry it in a number of different ways. So this is a more traditional approach with the chilies here, where they're strung up on a piece of cotton or twine and dried under, usually under an outdoor roof of some form, protected from the elements, but having access to fresh air to help dry them out. Herbs are usually done that way as well. Quite commonly, they're hung up to dry in that fashion. Still done a lot in Europe. These ones are what you would have done either in a dehydrator. Most people probably used to using an electrical one at this stage, but you can use a solar dehydrator off grid as well, where you use just the evaporative power of sunlight on the fruit and veggies to dehydrate them, and then put them in the glass containers here to help preserve them. Also, you can use these dryer packs that you quite often find in medicines or other foods that you may have or even purchase online to help avoid any moisture buildup if you're not sure whether you've got it fully dried or not. And of course, here's another form that you can use, which is the fruit leathers or fruit roll-ups, where you can basically blend the fruit. This is useful if you've got a lot of end-of-life fruit. It's starting to become blemished or bruised, you can just blend it all together and dry it in one layer and then wrap it up and store it. Very, very easy to use, very handy to have. This one's another one, fermenting. I'll just mention again that the process used here is lacto fermenting. So in a sense, it's a bit like what you would consider happening to the food in your stomach. It's a bacterial process, so it doesn't produce alcohol in any way. It produces beneficial bacteria, essentially probiotics and prebiotics. And it does that by using an airlock like this. So with all the storage methods, the main thing that you're trying to do is to stop both bad bacteria and air from accessing the food, because they're the main things that cause contamination and hence, you know, either disease like botulism or molds and stuff to grow. So that's what you're trying to avoid, is to stop air or bad bacteria getting into the food. This is very traditional type of ferment. That's Korean kimchi, which is cabbage and chili and so on. It can be done as blends like that. You can ferment sauces. You can do it as straight vegetables like carrots here, or combinations. Essentially, they go slightly sour, a bit like a pickle in a way. But the texture can vary depending on what type you're using, the vegetables, and how long you do it. This is another more modern method, which is vacuum sealing. This one works because, again, you're taking that air away from the food. So if you've got a lot of food that you maybe have chopped up to preserve and you didn't get it all done in time, then this is certainly a good way of storing it temporarily until you can get to it again to create either a fruit roll-up or canning or fermenting or whatever you need to do. So these are a good option at the moment, but like I said, unfortunately, it's a resource that's based on electricity and purchasing plastic bags, so it won't be useful continuously. Looking at some curing methods, these are generally done more for meat products, but I'll just mention a few. This one is using what's called oil sealing or potting. The potting was a very common method, again, in Ellen White's time for preserving meats. Different meats would be blended and stuffed into jars a bit like this. And then quite often you'd have fat or oil poured over the top. At that time, it'd most likely be things like the lard or the tallow that came off the meat, and that would form a seal over the top that would stop the air from and bad bacteria from getting to that meat underneath and preserve it for quite a long time. These ones are actually cheeses done in the same way. You can do vegetables preserved in oil. We've probably all seen the sun-dried tomatoes and so on preserved in oil. And another common one is preserving things like herbs and spices and even some veggies in olive oil to give a flavoured oil for use in your cooking and so on later on. This one uses salt or salt water or pickling, which can use vinegar for a similar effect. Sometimes it's just packing the meat, usually with the salt like that. Also, some veggies do that. So olives, for example, are packed in salt for their processing, and you can also do it with eggs and other products as well. So that's something you could do, but again, you can see by the amount of salt that it takes a lot of salt to do that. And again, that could be very much a limited resource in the future. Smoking, again, based predominantly on meats for a good preservation time period. For things like vegetables, and vegetarian foods, tofu, cheeses, and that sort of stuff are often smoked. A lot of veggies can be smoked, but it's usually more for flavour rather than preservation in that sense. These types are more useful for off-grid and country living, and that's the evaporation methods. So some places you'll see them have these Zeer pots, or you might see it mentioned. This one is very much one that's based on what your situation is and where you're located. So this is based on evaporation. So you can see here, this outside layer between the two pots is filled with sand. So that you have water in there, and over a period of time, the pots are usually terracotta or clay, which is porous, and the water evaporates through it, which causes cooling within the internal area, and that reduces the temperature, obviously, to help. Now, the thing with these is it's not going to act like a 40-degree Fahrenheit refrigerator. It's actually going to drop at maybe 5 to 8 degrees, depending on the situation where you're at. And this is very much dependent upon the location that you're at. So, for example, if you're in Florida, where it's quite hot and humid, these are not going to be very useful, because you'd be lucky to drop 1 or 2 degrees because the humidity is just too high. You won't get the evaporation there. Whereas if you're out in a desert, for example, in a drier place like Texas or Mexico or something like that, these are something that would be more useful. But again, due to their size, you probably need multiple ones to store things, and it wouldn't be a long-term storage option either. It's just something that you might keep for a week or something like that. This one is a bit more common in some of the African countries. It's a charcoal or coal cooler, and it works by evaporation again. So here you can see the water tank on top of this one. This one, it's probably hosed down or something similar. But essentially, it's a wire frame or walls, and within those walls, it's packed with charcoal or coal. And the reason for that is that, again, the evaporation takes the hot air out from the inside as it draws out with the evaporation to the outside, and lowers the temperature inside. The advantage with the charcoal, obviously, is that because it's porous and has essentially many different sides to the one piece, it allows for a bigger surface evaporation, or surface area for evaporation, so it can cool a bit more than, say, the Zeer Pot. This is something that, you could build on your property if you wanted to. Like I said, I haven't seen many in the Western worlds, but apparently it's quite popular in Africa, where it's obviously a bit hotter and drier in places. This is the equivalent one that we've seen in Australia that I'm used to. It's called a Coolgardie Safe because it was used a lot in that region in Australia during the gold rush. And so it's essentially just a simple box frame that's got hessian around it or some form of porous material. And you can have the water either at the base, and the water is drawn up through the material and the evaporation happens that way to cool the inside, or you can have the water up the top and have the cloth lay through the water and down over the sides. Either way will work as long as it's able to get that evaporation process going. And again, it worked well for Australia in this area of Coolgardie and out Western Australia, because it was in the goldfields where it was essentially quite hot and quite dry. It wasn't up in the tropics type thing where it was wet and humid. This is one that I actually made, or similar to one that I made, where it was just a simple camping kitchen that was collapsible. So it has the material already made around it and the shelving already in it. all I did was simply put a basin of water up on top and connect the material down the side. That worked well for my place because at my place in the winter it was too cold, it would freeze if you leave it outside. But spring and fall or autumn, you could have it outside during the day for the evaporation to keep cool, and at night you could just leave it out there because it was a good temperature anyway. And then in summer you had to be a bit more careful. You probably not leave it out overnight because you get too many animals coming in then. But it worked well for quite a while on my property when my gas fridge wasn't working at the time. So the principle's quite good as long as you're using it in the right place. Here's some natural methods, again, good for off-grid. This is one that most people have probably heard of, and that's a root cellar. So storing things underground. This can be classed as a type of burying style of preservation as well. Usually you just dig underground a hole. Sometimes it can be a natural one. If you have a cave on your property, for example, that extends underground, you have a natural root cellar already there. You could utilize that, essentially making sure that there's no animals or vermin or something in there, but you could utilize that. This one here is the more modern methods where you basically dig a big hole into the ground or into the side of a bank. You put this in and that creates it all for you, and you cover it over again with dirt. So this is a common purchase for a lot of people who have the money to do it that way. I prefer to either dig into the ground and create it myself, or like I said, if you're being blessed with a cave, you've already got one there. For those with a spring on their property, a spring house is another method that was used over 100 years ago and even today. The reason is that the springs come from deep underground where it's cooler, and so the water will actually be quite cool compared to the outside temperature. And so if you can capture that cool water in that small building, then you can essentially reduce the temperature within that small building quite dramatically compared to the outside temperature, particularly if it's well insulated. So here you can see that they've got bricks, got stones and mortar there. I don't know if they're insulated under the roof there, but the more you insulate, obviously, the more efficient it'll work. But that could be an option for people as well. Similar concept is well storage. So if you have a well on the property that goes down, a couple of 100 feet or more, then you're looking at a much cooler area of water down there compared to the outside temperature. So what some people would do would be use things like cages that they use for catching fish and so on, and put food in there, put it into a bucket and lower it down into the water and store it in the water there. Obviously, that would only work for certain types of food that you're looking to store in the water. You obviously don't want to store things that are going to absorb the water and make it not edible or not pleasant to eat. And in a similar manner, you can do stream cooling. This is something that can work at my place because unlike the well, I don't have a well on my place. I do have the spring, but not a spring house. But I have a river behind my property similar to this, and it's about 5 degrees all year round because it's a higher elevation and it comes straight off the snow catchment area essentially. So it's pretty much 5 degrees all year round. So I could put some containers in there. Some people will put it in cages. Others will put it into a plastic container and form a sort of a barricade around it, put posts around it to hold it in there. So obviously you don't want it to wash away. Some people will put a chain and anchor it to one of the big rocks. So there's different ways of holding it in there, but the water being 5 degrees or much cooler anyway, due to evaporation of all that water coming down the river or creek, you go to get a much cooler temperature than you would compared to the outside. And lastly, it's not really a storage method, but remember that God provides a table in the wilderness. So foraging is a big one that I've used at my property too, that there's plenty of things you can eat, usually in the forest and bush around you. They're already there, different seasons, you get different things. The main thing there is make sure you know what you're eating. You don't want to eat anything that's poisonous or pick things that are going to cause allergies or, problems. So there's classes usually in most areas that you can do to find out what's local, and that will help to extend your food options on your off-grid property as well.